I think that Dorothy was somebody who invented a new way of being a faithful Christian in our time in relation to issues of poverty, war, injustice, racism, uh, oppression of an injustice of all kinds. She was a Catholic convert who came out of a background in journalism and engagement in kind of radical protest around the turn of the century. And when she became a Catholic, she struggled to find some way of connecting her faith with that passion for social justice. She founded a movement called the Catholic Worker in 1933 in the heart of the Depression, initially a newspaper that had the mission of promoting the Catholic social teaching of the church, concern for social justice, for the workers, for the unemployed. And then pretty quickly that turned into a practical response to the needs of the time through the practice of what she called the works of mercy, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked. So people began to come to the Catholic Worker office who were out of work or had no place to live, and she opened up a house there that provided shelter, housing, food, a soup kitchen for the hungry, and a kind of gathering place for unemployed to talk about ideas. But what was different about what she was doing compared to other sort of relief work of the time was that there was always this it was combined with a critique of the social order and a vision of a different kind of social order based on community and justice and brotherhood. I knew her at the very end of her life, the last 5 years of her life, when she was quite old, in her late 70s, early 80s, and she was effectively retired from the day-to-day, management of the house or of the newspaper. But she loved to talk about ideas and learn about people. She was incredibly interested in young people. She had such a youthful quality herself. A spirit of adventure. She never went into retirement in that sense. She was always engaged with what was happening and always ready for a fight. I mean, right up until the end of her life, she was refusing to pay taxes and willing to be kicked out on the street in protest, supporting the young people who were going to jail in various kinds of protests, starting a shelter for homeless women right at the very end of her life. So it was never done for her. She was always, she described her life as being on pilgrimage. That was the name of the column she wrote for the newspaper. There was never any end to it. She was just very inspiring and fun to be around. What struck me about Dorothy and the Catholic Workers was here were lay people, who really took their faith as a serious guide to daily life, not just kind of their religious observance, but had something to say about the matters that were in the daily news and how you organize your life and how you live your life in spirit of love and compassion and mercy, but also with a sense of prophetic engagement with the issues of the day. So for Dorothy, it was a total life. I didn't appreciate as much as I did, later, and especially when I came to edit her writings, her diaries, in particular, to see how much that life was rooted in day-to-day practice of her faith in what people might consider very traditional ways. She rose early every morning to read from her breviary, the book of kind of monastic hours. She would say the rosary. She went to Mass every day. She took part in the kind of feasts and celebrations and fasting of the church year. She was very engaged with the life of the stories of the saints in the church. And I think when I went there as a young person, I focused much more on the radical activism and the kind of heroic stands that she took on the public stage. And I was much less sensitive to the ways that was rooted in of a real discipline of daily participation in the sacramental and liturgical life of the church. What's interesting now is the way, in the construction of the narrative that is, created in the whole process of naming saints, that there is seems to be an interest in presenting Dorothy's story as the story of a kind of a great sinner, or who became a great saint. A St. Augustine kind of figure, a St. Paul on the road to Damascus has this big conversion and is a different person afterwards. And that's a certain kind of formula for thinking about the lives of saints. And so in that story, her abortion becomes a crucial point. And I think that it is a significant point about her. And I think that Cardinal O'Connor addressed that head on when he introduced her cause some years ago. He acknowledged that she'd had an abortion, and he addressed that in the context of, is that an impediment to her being a saint? And he said, no, I don't think so at all. It shows that I think it's a wonderful message that there's nothing we can do that separates us from the love of God. And she regretted this, and she moved on. And so he incorporated it, I think, as an aspect of her story, and as one that was significant and might actually touch people. But it was not a key central theme. And I think that, of course, it plays into the priority that the bishops and the church have given to the particular one aspect of the pro-life message, the opposition to abortion. And so Dorothy, there's the potential there that she could become the kind of patron saint of people who've had abortions, and as an anti-abortion saint. And that would be, I think, a distortion of her overall message, and I think was one of the kinds of things that she feared when confronted with the idea of being called a saint. Having her story shaped and adapted, fitted to an agenda that wasn't necessarily hers. And I think we see, aspects of that, both of those things happening, and her life being made a little bit, smoothing off the rough edges a little bit, the prophetic side, so that she doesn't make us uncomfortable, doesn't really challenge us. She inspires us. And then you also see the ways in which perhaps her message is, I wouldn't say hijacked, but adapted to serve an existing agenda or narrative that wasn't necessarily one she would claim. She had an enormous love for the church. She didn't identify the church with the bishops and with Rome and the Vatican. For her, the church that really attracted her was the example of poor working class people who worked hard all day long for very little money, struggled to support their families, and felt this compulsion to go to church on Sunday, and felt that in that experience they had the riches of a connection and experience of the transcendent, of the mystery, the love of God, that gave some kind of meaning and order and transcendence to their lives. And that was something that she just, had enormous love for and gratitude for. As for the institutional kind of structures, she recognized that they had their place, but she didn't expect all that much in the way of bishops. There's a letter that I found when I was collecting her letters where a prominent peace activist, a Catholic, said, Dorothy, my faith has been so threatened by the fact that the bishops are just not, speaking out on Vietnam as they should, And she said, I just have never expected that much from bishops. She said, we have to look to the saints. They're the ones who kind of provide a real touchstone for what the faith means. So, she, in her autobiography, she quoted a line by theologian Romano Guardini, who said the church is the cross on which Christ is crucified, and you can't separate Christ from his cross. I think that one of the reasons that Dorothy speaks to so many people in the church today is because she was able to bridge these kind of polarized factions by showing that it's possible to really love the church, but also be aware of its failings. It doesn't make you a disloyal Catholic if you are critical. On the other hand, it doesn't make you, it doesn't make you a better Catholic just because you see all the faults. Because ultimately she didn't think of the church as those people out there. She thought that I'm as much the church as anyone. I have my own sins. I have my own failures, and her primary concern was her own failings and faults, not pointing a finger at other people. There's a wonderful passage in her autobiography where she describes how, as a child, a Catholic neighbor, little girl, had shown her books about the saints, and she was very inspired by them. But at a certain point, she was dissatisfied, and she said, where were the saints to change the social order, not just to bind up the wounds of the victims? Where were the saints to do away with slavery, not just to care for the slaves? So she recognized, the need for a different kind of saint. And at that point, what that basically, preceded was her kind of alienation from Christianity that lasted for many years. But I often looked at that passage and thought, well, Dorothy, in that insight, she kind of defined her own vocation, the need for a new kind of saint in our time, one who doesn't just minister to the victims of society, but tries to change the social order. So that, I would say, is the kind of saint she was, if you want to call her that. But she, I really learned about the saints, through Dorothy. Learned from her incredible interest and devotion to their stories, their humanity, not just the legends about them, but to look at them in their social context, how they responded in faith to the problems that they encountered. But she also, it was not just that she looked to them for inspiration. She really accepted the whole idea of the communion of saints and the idea that the saints could be powerful helpers and patrons, intercessors for us, so that she would, whenever there was concern about paying the bills or paying for the food at the Catholic worker, she would, pray to St. Joseph, for help. She looked to individual saints for examples of courage or patience or passion for justice or for charity. She was very conscious of her own failings, her own capacity for anger, judgment, self-righteousness. But it was this ongoing struggle day by day to work on those things, to bring them to confession, to try to reflect, more a spirit of love. And she believed that all of us are called to that. That's why we become. That's what it means to be a Christian, is to be on that journey. And so she had a sense of her connection with all the other saints, canonized or not, but wanted to. I think that was one of the most important messages that she had in the Catholic Worker, that what we're doing here is not just for something that saints do. This is something, maybe not living in a Catholic Worker, but in your daily life, there are ways that you can be more charitable, you can promote justice, you can promote peace around you and in the community that you live in. The church didn't make a big fuss when she died, as you would think they would for the most important Catholic of our time. The Archbishop of New York came and blessed her body outside the church for her funeral, but he did not celebrate the Mass, and there were no Catholic bishops attending. I think that well, one could argue what that statement means, but I think that when you look at the other figures, the great Catholics of her time, whether you want to, Cardinal Spellman or certain Thomas Merton, an important figure, Fulton Sheen, Clare Boothe Luce was an important figure. I think that all of them really, except for her friend Thomas Merton, I think a lot of these people, great Catholics, will, I think, not be, they're forgotten within a generation, or they don't really necessarily speak very much to contemporary times. There's something about Dorothy that remains ever so fresh and modern, because she was so engaged with all of the themes, the issues of our time, revolution and ecology, and as a woman, and the emergence of the role of women in society, as a protester, as somebody who went to jail, as somebody who was with the poor, and as a writer, and as somebody who spoke to the public. And tried to and created a kind of style, a way of being Catholic that continues to attract and be significant, inspiring to so many young people who carry on with the Catholic worker today. On the question of peace, the whole teaching of the Church on attitude toward war has shifted steadily, much closer to the position of Dorothy Day. It's still not a pacifist church by any means, but at least from the official organs of the Church, much higher bar that has to be raised to accept legitimacy of violence or war, and that was beginning there at Vatican II, when she went to the council in Rome, and with other women fasted for 10 days, praying for the council to address the issue of nuclear weapons. And then she was rewarded in effect when they did issue a document in Gaudium et Spes, where they said that any use of weapons of indiscriminate destruction against cities or non-combatants is a crime against humanity that deserves unreserved condemnation. It was the only condemnation issued at the Second Vatican Council. Soon after her death, the American Catholic bishops issued two very significant documents, one on the economy and one on war and peace. And both documents acknowledged the contributions of Dorothy Day. The one on peace was very important because it was the first time, I think, an official document from the bishops acknowledged that the pacifism of Dorothy Day, for instance, though not normative for the Church, was an authentic and real option for Catholics living out the message of Jesus. I think that Dorothy Day is definitely a common ground person because she was able to hold in tension both that incredible devotion to the Church, love for the Church, engagement in the liturgical and sacramental life of the Church, with an awareness of its failings. She was, in that sense, I think that there's something there that she wouldn't have liked terms like left and right or conservative, progressive. When you see a person like Dorothy Day, in which those kind of polarized terms don't really apply, you recognize you're in the presence of somebody who does provide that kind of common ground. And I think it has been. I mean, at the time she died in 1980, I would have been happy if she'd been acclaimed as a saint right then. But she would have been claimed by those in the peace movement and those in the social justice movement. And I think it might have been as much of a reduction of her total message as it would have been if she had only been recognized because she had an abortion and regretted it, or because she was a faithful daughter of the Church. She was all these things. And I think it's with the passage of time, the decades that have passed since her death, that really her measure and her true challenge for all of us becomes more clear.